The concept of the square of the pawn is not just for beginners. And let's just do a quick refresher to make sure everybody remembers exactly what we're talking about. Let's look at this position. It's white to move. White's moving up the board. The black king has invaded your territory. Your H pawn is a passed pawn. Looks like it has a clear shot. Should you move it? In today's lesson, of course, we're talking about the square of the pawn, so you should know that the answer is going to be no, because we can calculate the square either by counting how many moves up and the same amount sideways, which would be 5 plus, well, 5. And you can see the black king is going to be in the square of your pawn, or you could do it the quick way and just go diagonally from the pawn to the back rank, and then see that that's your outer border. So the king will be able to catch your pawn. So moving the pawn right now would be a mistake. The black king would be able to come back and go capture it. And it's tough for your king to break through over there on the queen side. A simple win for white instead would just be king c5, blocking off that path for the black king. But let's look at some more ideas with the square of the pawn. Seeing the black king on the far side of the board here, white has one winning move. And you probably guessed it, g5. And if they take with a pawn, obviously you're pushing through. If they take with a bishop, no problem. Sack the rook, and no matter how they capture, even if they capture on that F file, which is closer to the black king, he's still outside of the square of the pawn. So we use the idea of the square of the pawn to find a winning plan. Here, white deflects the king outside of the square of the pawn. Usually it's not going to be with queen still on the board, but when it is, oh man. So check and pawn push, the queen can't get back, and white wins the game. Now, even if the king is in the square of the pawn, if there's two pawns, then you can deflect him out of one of the squares. As you can see from this example, the pawn pushes, and the king can't stay in the square of both pawns. Now he's, of course, right next to the A pawn, but he's going to have to move outside of the square of the D pawn now to capture it. And if he goes back, well, things just get worse. Now, you might have to create that situation where there's two different pawns. And so here, a simple example, the buddy system. You create the passed pawn on that side. The king is inside the square, but now g4, next move f5, and you'll break through and have those two separate passed pawns. In some cases, your opponent's king is in the square of the pawn, but he's obstructed, he's blocked. Here, the black king is obstructed from getting to that king side. Now, not for long. Black's about to play this pawn push and give the king a nice clear path over to the king side. So you have to act quickly and play h5 right away. It's your only winning move. And after the pawn takes, now your f pawn can go running up, and the black king's obstructed or blocked from getting back and catching your pawn. And of course, if you're just overwhelming your opponent, he's overworked, he can't deal with all these different threats. These pawns are just running to the other side. There's nothing you can do to stop that. In some instances, we can make a sacrifice in order to set up a situation where we can force a trade and get to a pawn endgame in which the king is outside the square. So here, white plays f7, and after black captures, check, forcing the trade of queens, and of course, the black king is way outside the square of the pawn. And here's an interesting one. I call it the shifting or growing square of the pawn. Because right now, the square of the pawn just goes 1, 2, 1, 2. It's this nice little tight square of 9 squares, 3 by 3. But after you sacrifice here, this is a rare instance when it's a knight on the back. Now you can push up. No other piece. Imagine any other piece there, it doesn't work. But now you push, and your square just grew. Now it goes all the way out to the E file, and white wins the game. Now this is a fun example because it looks like the black king is going to be getting back in time. After this pawn push, he moves here, and hard to see it. Oh, there it is. You can create the passed A pawn at the same time that you obstruct black's king from catching up to your A pawn. So after this capture, of course, you take back, and 3 moves later, you have your queen. The black king is blocked because of your clever sacrifice. All right, pawn breakthroughs. These almost always have to do with the square of the pawn. You have to figure out, is that king going to be able to get over in time? Because a lot of times when you make a pawn breakthrough, they don't take you. They just start marching their king over, like in this example. It's pretty obvious that if the B pawn takes, then the A pawn goes running. And by the way, the white king can capture that passed C pawn and E pawn, no problem. So the black king comes running over, and now another push. And it's not the buddy system though, it's clearing that C pawn out of the way, because if you capture the D pawn back, obviously the black king is in the square of that pawn. So instead, you push here, and he takes. If you take back again, then you're in the square. The king can move into the square of the pawn. So instead, A5. And you gave up 3 pawns to get that one valuable pass pawn that's going to promote and win the game for you. Here, in 1913, Capablanca and Lasker played a casual game. And Lasker's black. He plays his king over, says, I'm in the square of the pawn. I see you're going to use the buddy system, create a pass pawn. But Capablanca had a clever idea. He plays H6, and leaving the G pawn there, he prevents Lasker from being able to come back over. And Lasker just looked at it and was like, okay, yeah, I resign, because next move, G6. You're either going to take them or they'll take you, and your H pawn will promote. So very clever in-game play by the in-game master Capablanca. And finally, we see the ultimate square of the pawn position, the Reti position, from 100 years ago, 1921. And it looks really bad for white, because here's the square of the pawn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so now that's the square of the pawn. The white king doesn't go after the black pawn. He goes after the square of the pawn. And the black king is stopping the white pawn easily, right? He's sitting there in the square, ready for it to push, no problem. And so in Reti's composition from 1921, his king goes towards both pawns. Well, towards the square of the black pawn and towards supporting his own pawn. At this point, black realizes that if he pushes the pawn, the white king simply comes over. And so he brings his king to attack the pawn, thinking, okay, you're still 2 moves away from the square of the pawn. But with one more move, the king approaches both the white pawn to support it and the square of the black pawn. And so, of course, if the king takes, then the white king is into the square. And if he doesn't, and black pushes, then both players are going to promote and get a queen. All right, there's some pretty advanced stuff using a pretty simple concept, the square of the pawn. I'll check you later.